Hello everyone, my name is Ryan and welcome back to another video. Now today in this video we're actually going to be talking about some art. Specifically we're going to be talking about human anatomy and human proportion. Now without further ado, let's jump straight into the video. So first of all, human anatomy and human proportion is an extremely big and very broad topic, and personally I am not very good at drawing humans and people in general. So if you're seeking, let's say, more professional help in drawing anatomy or people and proportion and such, my biggest recommendation would be to go read a book or consult a professional about the sort of topic, since I'm probably not the most professional person out there to be giving advice. But that being said, I am pretty good myself and I do have a pretty thorough understanding, so if you're willing to perhaps want my help, then yeah. People in general are somewhat hard to draw correctly. Now there are a lot of things to consider when you're drawing people, and depending on how familiar you are with drawing people and depending on what you know and how often you've drawn it, for example, it does become easier to draw the more you draw, as I've repeated multiple times so far. In other words, many of you have probably drawn a person sometime in your life, whether it's a basic stickman or maybe some sort of somewhat cartoony figure of someone else you know. And no matter who you are, you've probably seen a person before. Now, the reason drawing people in proportion and anatomy is important is because, well, quite obviously, if you don't draw the proportions and anatomy correctly, you don't exactly draw a person. Now, I'll make it clear that anatomy and proportion are pretty similar topics and they do go hand in hand, but generally I'll use the word proportion because that's the word I've been taught with. So if you ever get confused what anatomy and proportion mean, they're relatively the same thing, and I might make a video to clarify that, but for now they're pretty much the same thing. You don't really have to worry about the terminology and such. That being said, it's important to learn proportion because, well, let's say the most common scenario, if you're drawing a person, you want to make sure you draw the person to their likeness. By that I mean you want to draw a person so that they look like the actual person you're trying to draw instead of some random stranger or whatever. Of course, I shouldn't need to explain why it's important to draw people as what they look like, well, depending on what you want to do in your future. But anyways, that's pretty much the whole point of learning how to draw human anatomy. Now, when it comes to drawing people, there are a bunch of different rules and variations of these rules depending on who you ask. For example, some people have different measurements and different proportions than other people, and depending on who you ask and depending on what their style may be, they may draw things slightly different than, let's say, some other people. However, overall, most artists do follow a general rule when it comes to drawing people in terms of height and width and stuff like that, which I will explain based on my knowledge. So to reiterate what I said earlier, many people draw human proportion differently. So this video is just explaining my way and how I draw human proportion and how I was taught to draw it. And of course, your method or someone else's method may differ, but generally they do revolve around the same sort of criteria. Now, to demonstrate how human proportion anatomy works, I'm going to be showing you some different images of models of people I've gathered from Google Images, and most of them of course are stock photos and whatever that I hope I've gotten legally and without any copyright infringement whatsoever. But that being said, they shouldn't be copyright infringed, but yeah, just gonna let you know. So the general basics of drawing people comes down to mainly height. Now, generally speaking, most people are around 7.5 to 8 heads tall. And depending on their body type, this is of course the general standard for people when it comes to drawing height. Now, children and infants are generally smaller. Infants and babies usually ranging around, I think, 3 or maybe 4 heads tall, and children around, let's say, 6 or 5. Different positions do vary a bit more compared to height and such, but you don't really need to know that if you're learning about the basics. Now, when it comes to proportions of other body parts, arms are generally shorter than legs. The middle of the heads, or the middle of the height, aka around 4 to 4.5 heads tall, would be around the middle of your body, which would be around your waist, which would be the area that divides the legs and the body. That was a really complicated way of saying that, but yeah. The shoulder width of a person should approximately be 2 heads, as in top to bottom, forehead to chin sort of method, but not side to side, but mainly one on top of the other, flip to the side, which I think will make more sense when I demonstrate it in a second. Another quick tip would be that hands should be as large as your face and that your feet should be larger than your hands. So if you revolve around that sort of ratio or ratio system, I guess, you shouldn't be far off from actual human proportions. Now, to demonstrate what I mean by these human proportions, I've prepared, as I mentioned before, some random images of random people I found on the internet, and so we're just going to see if these people are in fact proportionate, so to speak. So the first thing you want to do, I guess, when you're measuring proportions is usually you would do this visually with, like, let's say a pencil in your finger, which is a method I will explain in another video. But basically, for now, because we have digital tools, we're just going to measure this by literally drawing on an image and see if this person is in fact proportionate. Now we'll start off by drawing, let's say, the head height, which is around there minus that little bit of hair on the top, and we have the chin, which goes over here. So the total height of this guy's head is, let's say, symbolized by this rectangle over here. Symbolized, I don't think is the right word, but you know what I mean. So what we do now is we select this this rectangle, basically this head over here. We put on another layer so it's easy to move, and we just move it downwards. And that's how we measure it. That's pretty much how you measure it, yeah. Draw another line. Oh, hold on. Put on another layer. Draw another line. And keep going. So now with each of the heads marked out with a simple line, we can now begin to see that this person is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, approximately 8 heads tall. Now if you want to measure the shoulder width ratio or comparison, all you have to do is, well, in this case, turn this model around, turn this rectangle around, line it up here, and as you can see already from this very simple, very rough eyeball estimate, this is in fact half of his head, or one head is in fact lined up to the middle of his neck, if that makes any sense when I say that verbally. As you can see, the length of the shoulders is in fact equal to 2 heads, exactly as I mentioned before. Now with the second person over here, as you can see, I've also sketched out and mapped out its proportions, and you can see that the person is approximately 7.5 to 8 heads tall. Now I say 7.5 because if you look carefully at her feet, you may notice that she is wearing some sort of high heels or some sort of tall shoes, so that is also sort of somewhat altering the height recording. But basically 7.5, 8 if you're tiptoeing, and yeah. Now, another thing to point out is that the person over here, this woman over here, compared to this man, her shoulder length, although it is also 2 heads wide, is somewhat just a little bit shorter and doesn't really match up to 2 heads of length, where compared to this person over here, as you can see, it's quite obviously, quite clearly fitting the 2 head length. Now, in terms of similarity, the first head, of course, is always going to be the size of the person's head. The second head, of course, goes to approximately, I'd say, the middle of the chest region, if you know what I mean. Approximately the middle of the upper chest. The third head should, I think, depending on what sources you read, I've read some sources that say the third head is approximately where your belly button would be, which, from looking at these images, does sort of kind of make sense. But in other words, it's probably where your gut would be in a more logical and common sense. Now the fourth line should be, it's a little lower for both these images, but it should be approximately where your waist is, or at least where your crotch line, the word is, the crotch line where it would be, which is aka the very lower area of your waist. It does seem to be more near the waistline though, especially for the male over here compared to the female over here, but that is also assuming that the pants probably go up to a little bit, I'd say around this height. I'm just going to guess based on what I know about jeans. There's nothing special about the fifth head, but as you can see for both illustrations, the sixth head is approximately where the knees are located, and that's something very interesting to notice. After that, the eighth head, or the final head, 7.5 or whatever, is of course the feet or the sole of your foot. Or the heel, I guess, depending on how you want to measure it. Of course, this one, the person's boots is a little bit higher than usual, and over here, this person is wearing high heels, so that accounts for the 7.5 heights. So these are the most basic of basic rules when it comes to drawing people. Now, if whatever person you're drawing does match these rules, as long as they match these rules, you should be completely fine, and that person you're drawing should look completely normal, and there shouldn't be too many problems. Now, if you take a look at these two other individuals that are completely different from the other two, you'll notice that after measuring them out again, they also have very similar proportions and measurements to the other two individuals. So as you can see, the first head is always the first head, the second head goes to the middle of the upper chest region, the third head goes to the stomach region, the fourth head goes to approximately the middle, the fifth head is nothing special, the sixth head always goes for the knees, as you can see in both these images, the seventh head is nothing special, and the eighth or 7.5 head is, of course, at the bottom of the feet level. Now, this one's a little peculiar because just because the person is standing with their feet across, so I'm just averaging around the middle of both these feet. Now, in terms of arm length, you can see that the shoulders start to appear around the middle of the second head, so around 1.5 heads, and the arms extend no further than 5 heads. Now, you could maybe debate that the third head is around where the elbow region is, but that does somewhat depend based on who you ask, so I would say maybe it's kind of an interesting note, but I wouldn't rely on it. Another note you might want to consider when drawing people and their arms is whether or not they're raising or shrugging their shoulders. That could also possibly affect the height of their shoulders, although in my opinion, just a rough guess, I would say it would never go above your chin level. Now, you could also debate that the wrist area is also near the middle of the body, which in some cases, again, it is, but again, not something I would rely on 100% of the time, but again, a pretty good estimation and approximation. So if you want to use that, you can use that. Just a quick note. Now, I'd say you don't need super duper concrete evidence, but based on this small visualization, you can definitely notice that the hands are in fact smaller than the feet. However, they are somewhat around the size of the face. Now, in terms of feet to face size, well, I'm not super sure, but if you can raise your feet up to your face, I guess that would answer your question. But in other words, yeah, that also confirms the other note I made earlier about your feet and your hands and your face. So another example of the head height rule is demonstrated with these two children over here. Now, just to repeat, I have gotten these images just from Google Images, totally normal images. Yeah, okay. So as you can see, although the age isn't specified with these two photos, you can, however, notice that the head ratio, the head count, the head to height count, is definitely different compared to the adolescents and adults that we saw before. Now in this example, this person over here is only 6 heads tall, while this person over here is approximately 5.5 heads tall. Now from a logical standpoint, this head indication would mean that this person over here is a bit younger than this person over here, which of course, since the age isn't specified, we can only make an assumption based on their height. Now, since children tend to grow at a different speed than adults do, the proportions are definitely going to differ and vary quite significantly between different ages. Such example can be noticed that the third height level is approximately near the waist and the middle, while over here the third head looks like, based on here, a little above the height or the waist of this person. However, in both images, the 4.5 head does approximately revolve around the area where the knees would be in both images. However, in this image over here, this person's legs are generally longer than this person's. Now that we've covered the basics about human proportion, it's time to look deeper into the anatomy of humans. Now, when I say anatomy, I mean more human proportions, but in more detail, in regards to the muscle and bone and skeletal systems of said people. Now, a very famous example, and a very obvious example, would be, let's say, Leonardo da Vinci's sketchbooks. Now, these sketchbook images are very good examples of what I mean by anatomy, and if not a bit too detailed when it comes to the muscles and the skeletons and the nerves and tendons and whatever body parts or whatnot are in different areas of the body. Over here is a artistic sketch of the muscular system of the human body. So in general, the more you know about the human body and the more you know about how it works and the fine details of it, including the science and the biology and whatnot, the better logically you should be able to draw human people and human proportion. That, combined with practice in drawing people and use of different mediums, will in fact allow you to draw humans and people a lot better than you could have before. Now, the high extensive knowledge of human anatomy might not be always 100% useful. If you're drawing quote-unquote normal people or just normally athletically, physically fit people, then you don't really need such an extent of muscles and knowledge when you can mostly generalize each of the different body parts, which I will demonstrate later. However, if you do want to draw really, let's say, muscular people or really well-defined muscles, then look no further than DC Comics. Now, I know when I say that I'm referring to a very large franchise of comic books and comic book characters, but basically what I want you to notice is in DC Comics in particular, in that sort of style of comics, a superhero style of comics, and DC Comics being the only example I can pull up on a short notice, you'll notice that a lot of characters such as Superman and Batman have very exaggerated muscle masses. As you can see in this artistic representation, each of the muscles and each of the different muscles in the arms and the stomach and the legs are very well defined and well shaded, such that you can see each individual different muscle. What I'm trying to say is that they do a very good job at representing somewhat accurately, so I can assume, the human body and human anatomy, especially when it comes to large exaggerated muscle masses. That being said though, if you do exaggerate muscle mass, you are going to eventually run into some very minor proportion issues, mainly involving, I'd say, the width of the neck and the width of the shoulders. That's probably the most common issue you're going to run into if you're drawing exaggerated anatomy and muscles.